In this lecture, we will focus on the relationship between nationalism and racism. The lecture will be structured around two main questions in relation to a host of core readings on the subject. These questions are: one, critically assess the proposition that the affinity between nationalism and racism has been much exaggerated, and two, how are the categories of race and nation related to one another? The core readings which we will review in order to bring these questions into focus include the famous chapter on national culture from Frantz Fanon's classic 1961 book, The Wretched of the Earth, the chapter on patriotism and racism in Benedict Anderson's highly influential Imagined Communities, first published in 1983, and Homi Bhabha's dense but insightful 1991 article, Race, Time, and the Revision of Modernity. We will also seek to further complexify the relationship between the categories of race and nation by incorporating a gender analytic into our discussion through the inclusion of the concluding chapter of Anne McClintock's 1995 book, Imperial Leather, Race, Gender, and Sexuality in the Colonial Contest, titled No Longer in a Future Heaven, Nationalism, Gender, and Race, as well as Patricia Hill Collins' path-breaking 2001 article, Like One of the Family, Race, Ethnicity, and the Paradox of the American Family. On national culture. Let us begin with an analysis of how Frantz Fanon conceptualizes the distinction between the categories of race and nation in the important chapter on national culture included in his 1961 classic, The Wretched of the Earth, completed just months before his untimely death. The chapter was originally presented as a provocative statement made at the Second Congress of Black Artists and Writers held in Rome in 1959. It is an avowal of revolutionary commitment to the struggle for national liberation. To this end, the essay begins with an extended quote from Sekou Touré's, Guinea's first president, from an address also delivered at the same Congress, in which Touré excoriated the Black artists and writers present that they must fashion the revolution with the people. Indeed, that there is no place outside that fight for the artist or the intellectual who is not himself concerned with and completely at one with the people in the great battle of Africa and suffering humanity. The nation, the African continent, suffering humanity, conceived as concentric circles, convergent scopes of revolutionary struggle. Fanon then commences his own locution with the emphatic declaration that each generation must, out of relative obscurity, discover its mission, fulfill it, or betray it. This before announcing his intent to analyze the problem, which is felt to be fundamental, of the legitimacy of the claims of a nation. What ensues is an eloquent and elaborate defense of the contours and content of national consciousness, a consciousness which he distinguishes from nationalism in the colonial and specifically African context. In the process, he repeatedly juxtaposes national consciousness and racial consciousness, placing his revolutionary and emancipatory hopes on the former, despite his many hesitations and concerns expressed in his chapter on the pitfalls of national consciousness, while warning that the latter, racial consciousness, is ultimately toxic, bound to lead people down a blind alley. Fanon remarks upon and defends the passion with which Native intellectuals defend the existence of their national culture, which he admits may be a source of amazement. Yet he adds, those who condemn this exaggerated passion are strangely apt to forget that their own psyche and their own selves are conveniently sheltered behind a French or German culture which has given full proof of its existence and which is uncontested. Fanon thus affirms the passionate affirmation of the existence of the national culture where it has been oppressed and denied the forces of colonialism, and further observes that this passionate search for a national culture, which existed before the colonial era, finds its legitimate reason in the anxiety shared by Native intellectuals to shrink away from that Western culture in which they all risk being swamped. The threat of inauthentic assimilation, countered by passionate self-affirmation, where the self is articulated in explicitly national terms, at least for now. Fanon was, of course, trained as a psychiatrist. In this vein, he makes an incisive social psychological observation that the significance of this passionate affirmation of a national culture pre-existing colonialism can be located on the terrain of what he terms psycho-affective equilibrium. In his words, the claim to a national culture in the past does not only rehabilitate that nation and serve as a justification for the hope of a future national culture. In the sphere of psycho-affective equilibrium, it is responsible for an important change in the native. Conversely, if national self-affirmation proves crucial in the sphere of psycho-affective equilibrium and facilitates the struggle against colonial domination, the denial of national existence is part and parcel of the psychological dimension of the production and reproduction of colonial oppression. As Fanon argues, colonialism is not simply content to impose its rule upon the present and the future of a dominated country. Colonialism is not satisfied merely with holding a people in its grip and emptying the native's brain of all form and content. By a kind of perverted logic, it turns to the past of the oppressed people and distorts, disfigures, and destroys it. This work of devaluing pre-colonial history, he concludes, takes on a dialectical significance today. By dialectics, Fanon is referring to the idea of what George Ciccariello-Maher has dubbed the dynamic movement of conflictive oppositions. The moment of national self-affirmation would thus seem to be identified and diagnosed here by Fanon as a dialectical negation of the colonial negation of national existence of an oppressed and subjugated population or people on the part of the colonial conquerors. To this end, Fanon contends that the total result looked for by colonial domination was indeed to convince the natives that colonialism came to lighten their darkness. And given such a situation, such an historical and psychological dimension to the colonial assault, Fanon insists the claims of the native intellectual about the pre-colonial past are not a luxury, but a necessity in any coherent program. So far, the terms of dispute would seem clear enough, but at this point, Fanon introduces a crucial addendum to his line of argument. Specifically, he clarifies that the terms of reference in the dispute between the colonizers and the native intellectual about the past are not specifically national. Indeed, that the native intellectual who decides to give battle to colonial lies fights on the field of the whole continent. That if the past is given back its value, the culture extracted from the past to be displayed in all its splendor is not necessarily that of his own country. This because the colonial denial to which the native intellectual is responding is continental in scope and racialized. As Fanon puts the point, colonialism, which has not bothered to put too fine a point on its efforts, has never ceased to maintain that the Negro is a savage, and for the colonist, the Negro is neither an Angolan nor a Nigerian, for he simply spoke of the Negro. For colonialism, this vast continent was the haunt of savages, a country riddled with superstitions and fanaticism, destined for contempt, weighed down by the curse of God, a country of cannibals, in short, the Negro's country. In sum, Fanon insists, colonialism's condemnation is continental in its scope. The contention by colonialism that the darkest night of humanity lay over pre-colonial history concerns the whole of the African continent. As a result, Fanon continues, the efforts of the native to rehabilitate himself and to escape from the claws of colonialism are logically inscribed from the same point of view as that of colonialism. The native intellectual who has gone far beyond the domains of Western culture and who has got into his head to proclaim the existence of another culture never does so in the name of Angola or of Dahomey. The culture which is affirmed is African culture. The transvaluation of the worth of the Negro thus remains trapped in the racialized terms of reference introduced by the colonizers to justify their continent-wide project of pillage and plunder. As Fanon thus contends, the Negro, never so much a Negro as since he has been dominated by the whites, when he decides to prove that he has a culture and to behave like a cultured person, comes to realize that history points out a well-defined path to him. He must demonstrate that a Negro culture exists. Fanon makes it clear who is responsible for this racialization of thought, or at least for the first movement toward that thought. The blame lies squarely with those Europeans who have never ceased to set up white culture to fill the gap left by the absence of other cultures. In his words, colonialism did not dream of wasting its time in denying the existence of one national culture after another. Action, reaction, in accordance with a dialectical, dynamic movement of conflictive oppositions. Therefore, the reply of the colonized peoples will be straightaway continental in its breadth. This is why, Fanon contends, in Africa, the native literature of the last 20 years is not a national literature, but a Negro literature, which brings him to address the movement and concept of negritude, which he frames as the emotional, if not the logical antithesis of that insult which the white man flung at humanity. In a word, this rush of negritude against the white man's contempt showed itself in certain spheres to be the one idea capable of lifting interdictions and anathemas. The negritude movement, as Wikipedia summarizes, was a framework of critique and literary theory developed mainly by Francophone intellectuals, writers, and politicians of the African diaspora from the 1930s, aimed at raising and cultivating Black consciousness across Africa and its diaspora. Negritude was founded by Martinican poet Aimé Césaire, Léopold Sédar Senghor, the first president of Senegal, and Léon Demas of French Guiana. Negritude intellectuals disavowed colonialism and argued for the importance of a Pan-African sense of being among people of African descent worldwide. The intellectuals employed Marxist political philosophy in the Black radical tradition. The writers drew heavily on a surrealist literary style, and some say they were also influenced somewhat by the surrealist stylistics, and in their work often explored the experience of diasporic being, asserting one's self and identity, and ideas of home, homegoing, and belonging. Fanon points out that the poets of negritude do not stop at the limits of the continent. Indeed, that from America, Black voices take up the hymn with fuller unison. To this end, he draws a comparison with the Arab world, where the struggle for national liberty has been accompanied by a cultural phenomenon known by the name of the awakening of Islam, and where he insists the living culture is not national but Arab. So here he draws a distinction between national, pan-Islamic, and pan-Arab consciousness in movement, but the thrust of his argument remains the distinction and intermingling among national and different transnational modes of cultural expression and/or identification. The suggestion is, however, that the categories of Arab and perhaps even Islam are somehow analogous to the explicitly racial category of Black or the implicitly racialized continental referent of African. It is at this point where Fanon introduces the clear warning that this historical necessity in which the men of African culture find themselves to racialize their claims and to speak more of African culture than of national culture will tend to lead them up a blind alley. He uses the example of Blacks from the Americas to explain. The Negroes who live in the United States and in Central or Latin America, in fact, experience the need to attach themselves to a cultural matrix. And yet, he continues, little by little, the American Negroes realized that the essential problems confronting them were not the same as those that confronted the African Negroes. Indeed, he insists, the Negroes of Chicago only resemble the Nigerians or the Tanganyikans insofar as they were all defined in relation to the whites. Even so, he concludes, once the first comparisons had been made and subjective feelings were assuaged, the American Negroes realized that the objective problems were fundamentally heterogeneous. This leads Fanon to argue that negritude finds its first limitation in the phenomena which take account of the formation of the historical character of men. For Fanon, this historical character of men is distinctly national, not racial, in cultural content. As he puts it most memorably, Negro and African Negro culture broke up into different entities because the men who wished to incarnate these cultures realized that every culture is first and foremost national, and that the problems which kept Richard Wright or Langston Hughes on the alert were fundamentally different from those which might confront Leopold Senghor or Jomo Kenyatta. Having thus emphasized the primacy of national over racial modes of identification in relation to culture and problems that people face, Fanon returns to analyze in some more depth the trajectory of the native intellectual, to trace the successive steps towards the realization and fulfillment of the imperative to embrace the national liberation struggle. To this end, he emphasizes the process by which the native intellectual, who had long aspired to assimilate the colonial culture, comes to reject that culture. Fanon insists that this tearing away, painful and difficult though it may be, is however necessary. Again, his stress is on the psychological dimension. He contends in a most felicitous rhetorical flurry, if it is not accomplished, there will be serious psychoaffective injuries, and the result will be individuals without an anchor, without a horizon, colorless, stateless, rootless, a race of angels. Fanon then continues by considering the desperate attempts that these native intellectuals undertake to hold on to their dearly achieved colonial cultural inheritance. And it is here where he locates the urge on the part of the native intellectual to embrace an allegedly universal perspective. In this vein, Fanon writes, the intellectual who is Arab and French, or Nigerian and English, when he comes up against the need to take on two nationalities, chooses, if he wants to remain true to himself, the negation of one of these determinations. But most often, he continues, since they cannot or will not make a choice, such intellectuals gather together all the historical determining factors which have conditioned them and take up a fundamentally universal standpoint. Fanon further interprets, This is because the native intellectual has thrown himself greedily upon Western culture. And so he concludes, like adopted children who only stop investigating the new family framework at the moment when a minimum nucleus of security crystallizes in their psyche, the native intellectual will try to make European culture his own. Yet, with the development of the national struggle, the attitude of the native intellectual begins to evolve. As Fanon explains, at the moment when the nationalist parties are mobilizing the people in the name of national independence, the native intellectual sometimes spurns these acquisitions, which he suddenly feels make him a stranger in his own land. Though he adds, it is always easier to proclaim rejection than actually to reject. Fanon proceeds to trace the trajectory of evolution of the native intellectual's posture across three phases. According to Fanon, in the first phase, the native intellectual gives proof that he has assimilated the culture of the occupying power. Then in the second phase, we find the native is disturbed. He decides to remember what he is. Correspondingly, he contends the intellectual tries to immerse himself in the nation. However, he continues, since the native is not a part of his people, since he only has exterior relations with his people, he is content to recall their life only in ossified form. Finally, in the third phase, Fanon insists, which is called the fighting phase, the native, after having tried to lose himself in the people and with the people, will on the contrary shake the people. He turns himself into an awakener of the people. This evolutionary process culminates with the full-fledged embrace of the national struggle. In Fanon's words, the native intellectual nevertheless sooner or later will realize that you do not show proof of your nation from its culture, but that you substantiate its existence in the fight which the people wage against the forces of occupation. For Fanon, the national culture is dynamic, always in motion, ultimately forged above all else in the process of struggle for liberation. It is in the end the opposite of ossified custom or tradition. In this vein, Fanon writes, when a people undertakes an armed struggle or even a political struggle against a relentless colonialism, the significance of tradition changes. If the truths of a nation are in the first place its realities, Fanon instructs, the intellectual, the artist, must ultimately reject the mummified fragments which, because they are static, are in fact symbols of negation and outworn contrivances, to seek out instead the seething pot out of which the learning of the future will emerge. In a similar vein, Fanon continues, it is not enough to try to get back to the people in that past out of which they have already emerged. Rather, we must join them in that fluctuating movement which they are just giving a shape to, and which, as soon as it has started, will be the signal for everything to be called in question. He here uses a most suggestive phrase to refer to this dynamic conception of culture. He calls it a zone of occult instability. In his words, let there be no mistake about it. It is to this zone of occult instability where the people dwell that we must come. And it is there that our souls are crystallized and that our perceptions and our lives are transfused with light. As such, any recourse to the past must ultimately be oriented towards the future and must always be organically embedded in the struggle. As Fanon puts it, the colonized man who writes for his people ought to use the past with the intention of opening the future as an invitation to action and a basis for hope. But to ensure that hope and to give it form, he must take part in action and throw himself body and soul into the national struggle. For Fanon, the fight for national culture simply cannot be separated from the fight for the liberation of the nation. In a word, since such liberation provides the material keystone which makes the building of a culture possible, there can be no other fight for culture which can develop apart from the popular struggle. This dynamic conception of national culture, forged in struggle, Fanon distinguishes from folklore and from abstract populism. According to Fanon, a national culture is nothing less than the whole body of efforts made by a people in the sphere of thought to describe, justify, and praise the action through which that people has created itself and keeps itself in existence. As a result, Fanon insists, a national culture in underdeveloped countries should therefore take its place at the very heart of the struggle for freedom which these countries are carrying on. And from this dynamic, creative, struggle-based conception of national culture, Fanon returns to condemn again the attachment to racialized consciousness. Along such lines, he contends, men of African cultures who are still fighting in the name of African Negro culture and who have called many congresses in the name of the unity of that culture should today realize that all their efforts amount to is to make comparisons between coins and sarcophagi. Fanon here demonstrates an unshakable faith in the destiny of national liberation and therefore the end of colonial domination. He chastises those who believe that it is possible to create a Black culture for having forgotten that Negroes are disappearing, just as those people who brought them into being are seeing the breakup of their economic and cultural supremacy. He adds in a telling phrase that links the ultimate of the national culture to a statist conception of political power. There will never be such a thing as Black culture because there is not a single politician who feels he has a vocation to bring Black republics into being. He thus throws his lot in with the revolutionary leaders who would found new republics. The problem, he insists, is to get to know the place that these men mean to give their people, the kind of social relations that they decide to set up, and the conception that they have of the future of humanity. He concludes, it is this that counts. Everything else is mystification, signifying nothing. Fanon doesn't entirely dismiss the usefulness of the negritude movement, so long as its advocates prove themselves capable of committing themselves to supporting the people's struggles. He insists, it is around the people's struggles that African Negro culture takes, not around songs, poems, or folklore. Likewise, he contends, no one can truly wish for the spread of African culture if he does not give practical support to the creation of the conditions necessary to the existence of that culture. In other words, to the liberation of the whole continent. In other words, to the liberation of the whole continent, republic by republic. If Fanon embraces a dynamic, creative, struggle-based, forward-oriented conception of national culture, this is in part because he considers the devastation wrought by colonial domination to be so intense, near total. Indeed, according to Fanon, after a century of colonial domination, we find a culture which is rigid in the extreme, or rather what we find are the dregs of culture, its mineral strata. In his words, the withering away of the reality of the nation and the death pangs of the national culture are linked to each other in mutual dependence. But again, ultimately, action gives way to reaction, and we witness the unfolding of a dialectical dynamic movement of oppositions. In such a vein, Fanon insists, in a colonized country, the most elementary, most savage, and the most undifferentiated nationalism is the most fervent and efficient means of defending national culture. For culture is first the expression of a nation, the expression of its preferences, of its taboos, and of its patterns. He continues, it is at every stage of the whole of society that other taboos, values, and patterns are formed. A national culture is the sum total of all these appraisals. It is the result of internal and external tensions exerted over society as a whole and also at every level of that society. He therefore concludes again in a deliberately statist vein. In the colonial situation, culture, which is doubly deprived of the support of the nation and of the state, falls away and dies. As such, he contends, the condition for its existence is therefore national liberation and the renaissance of the state. The fight for freedom opens the door to creation. Indeed, Fanon emphasizes that there can be observed on the eve of the decisive conflict for national freedom, the renewing of forms of expression and the rebirth of the imagination. Fanon further exhibits faith that from the struggle will emerge a new man, indeed a new humanism, in addition to a new national culture. He writes, after the conflict, there is not only the disappearance of colonialism, but also the disappearance of the colonized man. This new humanity cannot do otherwise than define a new humanism both for itself and for others. It is prefigured in the objectives and methods of the conflict. He continues, a struggle which mobilizes all classes of the people and which expresses their aims and their impatience, which is not afraid to count almost exclusively on the people's support, will of necessity triumph. He concludes, the value of this type of conflict is that it supplies the maximum of conditions necessary for the development and aims of culture. Fanon concludes his essay by addressing what he considers the mistake of those who call for a new humanism without embracing national consciousness. In this vein, he insists, we consider that the mistake, which may have very serious consequences, lies in wishing to skip the national period. If culture is the expression of national consciousness, I will not hesitate to affirm that in the case with which we are dealing, it is the national consciousness which is the most elaborate form of culture. The consciousness of self, he contends, is not the closing of a door to communication. Philosophic thought teaches us, on the contrary, that it is its guarantee. Here he distinguishes between national consciousness and nationalism. He writes, national consciousness, which is not nationalism, is the only thing that will give us an international dimension. He again returns to the scope of the continent to make a more positive connection between national consciousness and African consciousness. In his words, this problem of national consciousness and of national culture takes on in Africa a special dimension. The birth of national consciousness in Africa has a strictly contemporaneous connection with the African consciousness. As such, he contends, the responsibility of the African as regards national culture is also a responsibility with regard to African Negro culture. But he refounds the latter form of consciousness on explicitly political grounds, linking it to the necessity of and commitment to continent-wide struggle. He writes that this joint responsibility is not the fact of a metaphysical principle, but the awareness of a simple rule, which wills that every independent nation in Africa where colonialism is still entrenched is an encircled nation, a nation which is fragile and in permanent danger. In the very last paragraph of the essay, Fanon emphasizes that in the colonial and specifically the African context, the urgent task of the intellectual is to build up his nation. Fanon here demonstrates faith that so doing will of necessity be accompanied by the discovery and encouragement of universalizing values. To this end, he insists, far from keeping aloof from other nations, therefore, it is national liberation which leads the nation to play its part on the stage of history. Indeed, it is at the heart of national consciousness, he concludes, that international consciousness lives and grows, and this twofold emerging is ultimately only the source of all culture. And with that, we will take a break.